The dirt road stretched toward the horizon like a promise unfulfilled, and the rhythmic beat of hoofbeats against the hard, packed earth was the only sound for miles around as Penelope Foster pulled her wagon to a stop at the edge of Lewiston, Montana territory. The year was 1878, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street, illuminating the dust that seemed to coat everything and everyone in this frontier town. She had traveled too far to turn back now, even as doubt flickered across her face. Penelope straightened her back, adjusted her simple blue traveling dress, and tugged at the ribbons of her bonnet. At 22, she had left behind everything familiar in St. Louis to chase a dream of independence in the West. Her uncle's general store needed managing after his passing, and with no immediate family left to tie her down, the decision had been surprisingly easy. The execution, however, was proving more difficult than she had anticipated. The town of Lewiston wasn't much to look at: a single main street flanked by wooden buildings in various states of repair, a church steeple rising above the rest like a finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. Men in dusty clothes lounged outside the saloon, their curious gazes following her wagon as she guided her tired horses down the street. "Excuse me," she called to a gray, bearded man sweeping the boardwalk in front of what appeared to be a barber shop. "Could you direct me to Foster's General Store?" The man squinted at her through rheumy eyes. "You must be Harold's niece from back east." He pointed his broom down the street. "Third building on the right, just past the blacksmith's." "Thank you kindly," Penelope replied, snapping the reins gently to urge her horses forward. The store was exactly where the man had indicated, its weathered sign hanging at an angle that suggested neglect. Penelope's heart sank. The windows were grimy, and the porch sagged in the middle like an old mare's back. This was to be her new beginning. As she climbed down from her wagon, the door to the blacksmith shop across the street banged open. Heat and the acrid smell of hot metal wafted out along with a tall figure silhouetted against the forge's glow. Even from a distance, Penelope could see the man was powerfully built, his shoulders broad beneath a soot-stained shirt, his forearms corded with muscle as he wiped his hands on a rag. "You lost, madam." His voice carried across the street, deep and rough like stones tumbling down a hillside. Penelope straightened her spine. "Not at all. I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. I'm Penelope Foster, Harold Foster's niece. I've come to take over the store." The blacksmith stepped fully into the light, and Penelope's breath caught in her throat. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and eyes the color of a summer storm. A scar ran along his left cheekbone, white against his sun-bronzed skin. "Jake Adams," he said, crossing the street with long strides. "Your uncle was a good man. Town hasn't been the same without him." Penelope nodded, unsure what to say. Up close, Jake Adams was even more imposing, standing at least a head taller than her, the scent of smoke and iron clinging to him. "I'd offer to help with your bags," he said, gesturing to her wagon, "but I've got a stubborn piece of metal waiting for me that'll cool if I don't get back to it." "I can manage," Penelope assured him, lifting her chin. "I didn't come all this way to start depending on strangers the moment I arrived." A hint of a smile touched Jake's lips, but it disappeared so quickly Penelope wondered if she'd imagined it. He tipped his head toward the store. "Doors probably swollen with the rain we had last week. Give it a good kick at the bottom if it sticks." Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode back to his shop, leaving Penelope to stare after him, a mixture of irritation and curiosity stirring within her. The door did indeed stick, and after a moment's hesitation, Penelope delivered a swift kick to its base. It swung open with a groan of protest, revealing a dim interior filled with shelves of goods covered in a thick layer of dust. The smell of neglect, musty and stale, greeted her like an unwelcome relative. Penelope stepped inside, her footprints marking the dusty floor. This would be her home now, the small living quarters at the back of the store her sanctuary. As the reality of her situation settled over her, she squared her shoulders. She'd never been one to shy away from hard work, and she wasn't about to start now. By the time she'd unloaded her wagon and stabled her horses at the livery, the sun was setting. Her muscles ached from the journey and the effort of carrying her belongings into the store. She'd managed to clear enough dust from the living area to make it somewhat habitable, but the store itself would require days of work before she could reasonably open for business. A soft knock at the front door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find an older woman standing on the porch, a covered basket in her hands. "Mrs. Margaret Whitaker," the woman introduced herself with a warm smile. "I thought you might appreciate a hot meal after your journey." Travel rations aren't much comfort after days on the road. Penelope's stomach growled at the mention of food, and she realized she hadn't eaten since morning. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Whitaker. Please come in." "Oh, I can't stay, Mrs. Whitaker said, pressing the basket into Penelope's hands. "My husband will be wanting his own supper, but I'll come by tomorrow to help you get this place in order. Harold was a dear friend, and we've all been hoping someone would bring this store back to life." Before Penelope could properly thank her, Mrs. Whitaker was hurrying back down the street, her skirts swishing around her ankles. The meal, fried chicken, cornbread, and apple preserves, was simple but delicious. As Penelope ate by lamplight at her uncle's small table, she found herself staring out the window at the blacksmith shop across the street. Light still spilled from its windows, and occasionally she caught glimpses of Jake Adams moving about, his silhouette passing in front of the glow from the forge. She wondered about him, why a man with such obvious strength and capability would choose to remain in a small town like Lewiston when the West was full of opportunities for men willing to work hard. There was something in his eyes, a guardedness that suggested depths beneath the gruff exterior. A foolish train of thought, she chided herself. She hadn't come to Lewiston looking for companionship or romance. She had a store to revive and a life to build. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Penelope was up with the sun, determined to make progress on the store. She just propped open the front door to let in some fresh air when the sound of hammering drew her attention to the street. Jake Adams stood on her porch, tools in hand, examining the sagging boards with a critical eye. "What are you doing?" Penelope asked, stepping outside. "Fixing your porch," Jake replied without looking up. "It's a hazard. Someone could break a leg stepping on these boards." "I didn't ask for your help," Penelope pointed out, though she knew the porch did indeed need repair. Jake finally glanced at her, those stormy eyes unreadable. "Didn't ask for your gratitude either, just fixing what needs fixing." Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I apologize. That was ungracious of me. Thank you for the assistance." Jake merely nodded and returned to his work, the muscles in his back shifting beneath his shirt as he pried up a rotted board. Penelope found herself watching him for a moment too long, before forcing herself to turn away and focus on the tasks inside the store. Mrs. Whitaker arrived as promised, bringing with her two other women from town, Mrs. Eliza Thompson, the preacher's wife, and Miss Sarah Miller, who taught at the small schoolhouse. The four women set to work with brooms, mops, and rags, attacking the dust and grime with determined energy. "You've certainly caused a stir in town," Mrs. Thompson remarked as they worked. "A young, unmarried woman taking on a business by herself, it's not something we see every day." I'm not afraid of hard work, Penelope replied, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn patch of dirt on the counter. No one's saying you are, dear, Mrs. Whittaker assured her, but a woman alone in these parts can face challenges. Jake Adams seems to have taken an interest, Miss Miller added with a meaningful glance toward the porch, where the rhythmic sound of Jake's hammer continued. He's simply being neighborly, Penelope said firmly, ignoring the curious flutter in her stomach at the mention of his name. Jake doesn't do neighborly, Mrs. Thompson said with a knowing smile. Not since he came back from the war. Penelope's curiosity got the better of her. He fought in the war, Mrs. Whittaker nodded. Cavalry. Came back different, they say. His family had a ranch outside of town, but after his parents passed, he sold most of the land and took up blacksmithing. Keeps to himself mostly, except for when he rides with the cattle drives. He's the best horse trainer in 3 counties, Miss Miller added. Ranchers bring their most difficult horses to him. He has a way with them that borders on magical, if you ask me. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Penelope found her thoughts returning to Jake Adams as they worked through the morning. By noon, the store was beginning to look presentable, the shelves cleared of dust, and the floor swept clean. The inventory would need to be assessed and organized, but that was a task Penelope could manage on her own. Outside, Jake had replaced several boards on the porch and was securing the last of them when Penelope stepped out with a glass of water. I thought you might be thirsty, she said, offering it to him. Jake straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his hand before accepting the glass. Thank you. He drained it in several long gulps, his throat working as he swallowed. The porch looks much better, Penelope observed. I'm grateful for your help. Jake handed the empty glass back to her. It needed doing. He gathered his tools, preparing to leave. Would you? Penelope hesitated, then pressed on. Would you join me for supper this evening, as a thank you for your work today? Jake's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or wariness. Can't tonight. Got horses to tend to. Penelope tried to hide her disappointment. Of course. Another time, perhaps. Jake loaded his tools into a battered leather satchel. This town needs this store, Miss Foster. Your uncle understood that. He extended credit when folks were struggling, kept fair prices even when suppliers tried to gouge him. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. People will be watching to see if you're cut from the same cloth. With that, he touched his fingers to his hat brim in a brief salute and crossed back to his shop, leaving Penelope to wonder if his words had been a warning or simply an observation. The next few days fell into a pattern. Penelope would rise early, work on organizing the store throughout the day, often with help from one or more of the town's women. And in the evenings, she would sit on her newly repaired porch, watching the comings and goings of Lewiston as the sun set. Jake's shop was a constant hive of activity. Ranchers and cowboys would arrive with horses or broken equipment, and Jake would attend to each with the same focused intensity. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the street, and he would acknowledge her with a nod before returning to his work. On the 4th day, as Penelope was arranging a display of preserved fruits near the front window, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to find Jake standing just inside the entrance, his hat in his hands. Mr. Adams, she greeted him, smoothing her apron. What can I do for you? Wanted to see if you had any horseshoe nails, he said, his eyes scanning the shelves. I'm running low, and the supplier won't be through for another 2 weeks. Penelope gestured toward the back of the store. I believe there's a bin of them near the tools. Let me check. She led him to a section she had organized just that morning, pulling out a drawer to reveal several compartments of various sizes of nails. These should suit your needs, she said, indicating the largest compartment. Jake inspected them with a critical eye before nodding. "These'll do." "I'll take all of them." Penelope raised an eyebrow. "All of them? That's nearly 5 pounds of nails. Like I said, supplier won't be through for 2 weeks. He reached for his wallet. "What do I owe you?" Penelope calculated the cost quickly. 50 cents for the lot. Jake counted out the coins and placed them on the counter. As Penelope wrapped the nails in brown paper, she gathered her courage. "Mr. Adams, I couldn't help but notice you seem to work with horses quite a bit." "Part of being a blacksmith," he replied, watching her tie the package with string. "Yes, of course, but I was told you have a particular talent for training them." She handed him the package. "I've been thinking of getting a horse of my own for shorter trips. The wagon is practical for hauling goods, but rather cumbersome for visiting farms or riding to church." Jake considered her for a moment. "You ride, I learned as a girl," Penelope said. "I'm not an expert, but I can stay on a horse's back well enough." A ghost of a smile touched Jake's lips. "I might have something suitable. Mare named Willow. Gentle disposition, but spirited enough to be interesting. Would you be willing to show her to me? When you have time, of course," Penelope added hastily. Jake tucked the package under his arm. "I finish up around sundown most days. Could bring her by tomorrow evening if that suits." "That would be perfect," Penelope said, trying to contain her excitement. "Thank you." Jake nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Store's looking good. Your uncle would be proud." Before Penelope could respond, he was gone, the bell jingling in his wake. She stood at the counter, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. The next day seemed to crawl by as Penelope found herself glancing repeatedly at the clock, anticipation building for Jake's visit. She told herself it was merely excitement about potentially acquiring a horse, but she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach whenever she thought of those storm-gray eyes. As promised, Jake arrived just after sundown, leading a dappled gray mare with a white blaze down her face. Penelope stepped onto the porch, unable to keep the smile from her face at the sight of the beautiful animal. "She's lovely," Penelope breathed, approaching slowly with her hand outstretched. "Easy with her," Jake cautioned. "She's curious about new folks but doesn't rush into friendships." Penelope held her hand steady, letting the mare sniff her fingers before gently stroking the velvety nose. "Hello, Willow. Aren't you a beauty?" The mare nickered softly, seemingly approving of Penelope's touch. "She likes you," Jake observed, a note of surprise in his voice. "The feeling is mutual," Penelope said, running her hand along Willow's neck. "May I try sitting on her?" Jake nodded, moving to help her. His hands were strong and sure as he lifted her into the saddle, the brief contact sending an unexpected jolt through Penelope. Once she was settled, he handed her the reins. "Walk her around a bit. Get a feel for her gait," he instructed, stepping back to watch. Penelope guided Willow in a slow circle, then down the street and back, familiarizing herself with the mare's movements. It had been years since she'd ridden regularly, but the rhythm came back to her quickly, and Willow responded to the lightest touch of the reins. "She's perfect," Penelope declared as she returned to where Jake stood watching. "How much are you asking for her?" Jake helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. $20, saddle included. It was a fair price, perhaps even generous, and Penelope didn't hesitate. "I'll take her." "Would you mind keeping her at your stable until I can arrange for proper accommodations?" "Already made space for her," Jake said. "No extra charge for boarding until you're ready." "Thank you," Penelope said sincerely. "Would you care for some coffee? Or perhaps something stronger?" "I have a bottle of whiskey my uncle left behind." Jake hesitated, and for a moment Penelope thought he would decline. But then he gave a short nod. "Coffee would be welcome." Penelope led him into the store and through to the living quarters at the back, suddenly conscious of the simplicity of her home. Jake didn't seem to notice or mind, taking a seat at the small table while Penelope busied herself with the coffee pot on the stove. "How long have you been in Lewiston?" she asked, setting out 2 mugs. "Going on 8 years now," Jake replied. "Came back after the war, took over the smithy when old man Harrison's hands got too twisted with arthritis to work the forge. And before the war," Penelope poured the coffee, adding a spoonful of sugar to her own. "Grew up on a ranch outside of town. My father raised cattle, taught me to work with horses." Jake accepted the mug she offered, his fingers brushing against hers. Not much to tell beyond that, but Penelope sensed there was much more to Jake Adams than he was willing to share. The war had left its mark on him, as it had on so many men, but she suspected his reserved nature ran deeper than those wounds. "What about you?" Jake asked, surprising her with his interest. "What brings a young woman from St. Louis to a place like Lewiston?" Penelope sipped her coffee, considering her answer. "After my parents died, I lived with my mother's sister in St. Louis. She's a good woman, but her idea of a suitable life for me involved marrying the son of one of her husband's business associates and settling into a life of tease and charity work. Not to your taste." Jake's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice. "I wanted more," Penelope admitted. "Something that was mine, that I built with my own hands. When Uncle Harold passed and left me the store, it felt like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even known I was saying." Jake nodded slowly, as if her words made perfect sense to him. "Freedom's worth more than comfort to some folks." "Exactly," Penelope agreed, warmed by his understanding. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the only sound the occasional creak of the building settling for the night and the distant piano music drifting from the saloon down the street. "I should be getting back," Jake said finally, draining the last of his coffee. "Early start tomorrow." "Of course." Penelope rose to walk him to the door. "Thank you again for Willow. She's exactly what I was hoping for." At the door, Jake turned to face her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly in the lamplight. "There's a gathering at the Thompson place on Saturday. Folks bring food, play music. Town's way of marking the end of summer." He paused. "Might be a good way for you to meet more of the community." Was he inviting her? Penelope couldn't quite tell. "That sounds lovely. Will you be attending?" Jake shrugged. "Maybe for a spell." "Not much for crowds these days." He settled his hat on his head. "Good night, Miss Foster." "Good night, Mr. Adams," Penelope replied, watching as he crossed the street to his shop, his long strides eating up the distance. As she closed the door, Penelope realized her heart was beating faster than usual. She told herself it was simply the excitement of acquiring Willow, but a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that the mare wasn't the only thing she found appealing about the evening. The gathering at the Thompson farm turned out to be larger than Penelope had anticipated. It seemed that everyone within 20 miles had come to celebrate, bringing dishes of food and instruments for the musicians who had set up in the cleared barn. Children ran between the adults, their laughter mixing with the fiddle music that filled the air. Penelope had baked 3 apple pies for the occasion, using the last of her sugar ration to make them special. Mrs. Whitaker had insisted on escorting her to the farm, introducing her to dozens of people whose names Penelope struggled to remember. "You've made quite an impression already," Mrs. Whitaker confided as they watched a group of young men and women twirling in a lively dance. "The way you've transformed that store in just a week, people are taking notice." Penelope flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "There's still so much to do, but it's starting to feel like home." "And what about Mr. Adams?" Mrs. Whittaker asked with barely concealed curiosity. "I couldn't help but notice he's been spending time at your establishment. He sold me a horse," Penelope explained, hoping her cheeks weren't as red as they felt. "And he's been kind enough to help with some repairs to the store." Mrs. Whittaker's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Penelope's casual tone. "Jake Adams doesn't help just anyone, my dear. That man has turned down good money for jobs he didn't feel like taking. If he's fixing your porch, it's because he wants to." Before Penelope could formulate a response, a hush fell over the gathering. She turned to see what had caused the sudden quiet and saw Jake standing at the edge of the barn, a bottle in his hand. He looked different, clean-shaven, his dark hair combed back, wearing a blue shirt that brought out the gray in his eyes. He nodded to a few people as he made his way to where Mr. Thompson was serving drinks. Well, Mrs. Whittaker murmured. "I believe that's the first time Jake Adams has shown his face at one of these gatherings since he came back from the war. And doesn't he clean up nicely?" Penelope couldn't disagree. Jake had a natural grace to his movements, a quiet confidence that drew the eye even as he seemed to prefer remaining unnoticed. She watched as he exchanged a few words with Mr. Thompson, accepted a glass of something amber-colored, and then leaned against a post, surveying the crowd. Their eyes met across the barn, and for a moment, Penelope couldn't breathe. Jake raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I believe I'll go see how Mrs. Thompson is managing with all these hungry mouths to feed," Mrs. Whittaker said, giving Penelope a gentle push in Jake's direction. "You should circulate, my dear. Meet more of your neighbors." Before Penelope could protest, Mrs. Whittaker had disappeared into the crowd, leaving her standing alone. After a moment's hesitation, she made her way toward Jake, stopping to greet people as she went. "Miss Foster," Jake said when she reached him, his voice lower and rougher than usual. "You're looking well this evening." Penelope smoothed her hands over the skirt of her best dress, a deep green cotton that she'd spent hours pressing for the occasion. "As are you, Mr. Adams. I wasn't sure you would attend." "Neither was I," he admitted, taking a sip from his glass. "But it seemed important to come." Something in his tone made Penelope wonder if her presence had influenced his decision, but she pushed the thought aside as presumptuous. "It's a lovely gathering. Everyone has been very welcoming." "Lewiston takes care of its own," Jake said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Once they decide you belong, that is." "And have they decided I belong?" Penelope asked, genuinely curious. Jake's gaze returned to her, intense and appraising. "I'd say you're making a convincing case." He nodded toward where her pies had been placed on the dessert table. "Those you're doing." "Apple," Penelope confirmed. "My mother's recipe. Might have to try a slice later." Jake shifted, seeming almost uncomfortable with the casual conversation. "How's Willow working out for you?" "Wonderfully. She's a joy to ride." Penelope smiled, remembering her morning excursions around the outskirts of town. "Though I still need to arrange proper stabling for her. I was thinking of asking Mr. Henderson at the livery if he might build a small stall behind the store." Jake frowned. "Henderson overcharges for shoddy work." "If you need a stable built, I can do it." "You've already done so much," Penelope protested. "I couldn't ask you to take on another project." "You didn't ask, I offered." Jake's tone brooked no argument. "I've got lumber left over from the Marshall place. Could have something simple but solid up in a day or two." "At least let me pay you for your time and materials," Penelope insisted. Jake considered this for a moment. "Fair enough. We can discuss terms later." The music changed to a slower melody, and couples began to form for a waltz. Penelope watched with a touch of envy as they moved gracefully around the cleared space. "You dance, Mr. Adams," she asked impulsively. Jake's expression shuddered. Not anymore. He set his empty glass on a nearby table. Excuse me, Miss Foster, I should check on something. Before she could respond, he was striding away, leaving Penelope to wonder what she had said to cause his abrupt departure. She felt a flash of irritation at his unpredictable behavior, followed quickly by concern. There was pain beneath his gruff exterior, that much was clear, but its source remained a mystery. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly enough. Penelope danced with several of the local men, including the sheriff and the bank manager, and sampled a variety of dishes that reflected the diverse backgrounds of Lewiston's residents. But her eyes kept straying to the edges of the gathering, searching for Jake's tall figure. She finally spotted him as the celebration was winding down, standing beside his horse at the edge of the Thompson property. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Penelope made her way toward him. "Are you leaving already?" she asked, approaching carefully so as not to startle him. Jake was checking his saddle girth but paused at her question. "Party's nearly over anyway. I thought perhaps." Penelope hesitated, then pushed forward. "I thought we might walk back to town together. It's a lovely night for a stroll." Jake's expression was unreadable in the dim light of the rising moon. "I'm not headed straight back. Got business to attend to first." "Oh," Penelope tried to hide her disappointment. "Of course. Another time, perhaps." Jake finished with his saddle and turned to face her fully. "I didn't mean to be short with you earlier. About the dancing." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Penelope was beginning to recognize as a sign of discomfort. Some things from before the war don't fit right anymore. It was the closest he'd come to sharing anything personal, and Penelope valued it accordingly. "I understand, or at least I'm trying to." Jake nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. "I'll come by tomorrow about that stable, mid-afternoon if that suits." "That would be fine," Penelope agreed. "Good night, Mr. Adams. Miss Foster." Jake tipped his hat, then mounted his horse with fluid grace. He hesitated, looking down at her for a long moment. "You should know something about me. I ain't got time for complications. My life is how I need it to be." Before Penelope could ask what he meant, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving her standing alone in the moonlight, more confused than ever about the enigmatic blacksmith. The next few weeks brought a shift in the weather, the heat of summer giving way to the crispness of early fall. Penelope's store was now fully operational, and she was beginning to recognize the rhythms of Lewiston, which days brought ranchers to town for supplies. When the stagecoach arrived with mail and passengers, how the community gathered at church on Sundays, regardless of their weekday disagreements. True to his word, Jake had built a small but sturdy stable behind the store, with room for Willow and space for hay storage. He'd refused to accept more than the cost of the few materials he'd needed to purchase, claiming the labor was simply a favor between neighbors. Their interactions had settled into a pattern of sorts. Jake would come to the store occasionally for supplies, or Penelope would see him across the street at his forge. They would exchange greetings, sometimes share brief conversations about the weather or local news, but nothing deeper. Jake maintained a careful distance that Penelope found both frustrating and intriguing. On a particularly beautiful autumn morning, Penelope decided to close the store for a few hours and take Willow for a longer ride. She packed a small lunch and headed out of town, following a trail Jake had mentioned that led to a creek with good fishing. The air was crisp, the sky an impossible blue, and Penelope felt a sense of freedom that had eluded her in St. Louis. Willow seemed to share her mood, prancing eagerly as they left the confines of the town behind. The trail wound through stands of pines and aspens, the latter blazing gold in their fall colors. After about an hour's ride, Penelope heard the sound of running water and guided Willow toward it. The creek was just as Jake had described, clear water tumbling over smooth stones, bordered by grassy banks perfect for a picnic. What Jake hadn't mentioned was that the spot might already be occupied. As Penelope rounded a bend in the trail, she saw a familiar figure crouched by the water's edge, a fishing line trailing into the creek. Jake looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, surprise evident on his face. "Miss Foster." "Mr. Adams," Penelope returned, feeling oddly like an intruder despite the fact that the creek surely didn't belong to him. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Free country," Jake replied with a shrug, though he didn't seem entirely pleased by her arrival. "Creek's big enough for two." Penelope dismounted and led Willow to a spot where the mare could drink. "It's a beautiful location. I can see why you'd come here to fish." Jake grunted non-committally, his attention returning to his fishing line. Penelope spread her blanket on a sunny patch of grass a respectful distance away and sat down, unpacking her lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices. They remained in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the burbling of the creek and the occasional call of a bird. Despite Jake's apparent disinterest in conversation, Penelope found the shared silence strangely comfortable. After a while, Jake's line went taut. With practiced movements, he pulled in a good-sized trout, quickly and efficiently dispatching it before adding it to a string of 3 others resting in the shallow water at the creek's edge. "You've had good luck," Penelope observed. Jake glanced at his catch. "Enough for a few meals." He hesitated, then added, "You're welcome to one if you'd like." The offer surprised her. "That's very generous, thank you." Jake nodded and fell silent again, rebaiting his hook before casting it back into the water. Penelope ate her lunch slowly, enjoying the peacefulness of the setting and the unexpected company, sparse though it was. "Why did you come to Lewiston?" Jake asked suddenly, startling Penelope with both the question and the break in silence. "I told you my uncle left me the store," she replied. Jake shook his head. "That's how you came to own the store, not why you chose to come all this way to run it yourself instead of selling it to someone local." Penelope considered her answer carefully. "I suppose I was looking for something I couldn't find in St. Louis. A purpose that was mine alone, not defined by what society expected of a woman in my position." "And have you found it?" Jake's eyes remained on the water, but Penelope sensed his full attention was on her response. "I'm beginning to," she said honestly. "The store provides for my needs, and I believe it serves a purpose in the community. But more than that, I feel, I don't know how to explain it, more myself here than I ever did back east." Jake nodded slowly, as if her answer made perfect sense to him. "Freedom to be who you are without apology, that's worth a fair bit of hardship." "Yes, exactly," Penelope agreed, surprised by his insight. "What about you? Mrs. Whittaker mentioned you had a ranch before becoming a blacksmith. That seems like quite a change." Jake's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Ranching was my father's life, not mine, after the war." He trailed off, then continued in a different direction. "Blacksmithing suits me, working with my hands, solving problems with fire and metal, simple. And the horse training." Penelope pressed gently. A ghost of a smile touched Jake's lips. "That's different. Horses don't lie, don't pretend to be something they're not. You earn their trust or you don't." "Unlike people," Penelope suggested. Jake's eyes met hers, sharp and appraising. "Unlike most people." There was something in his gaze that made Penelope's breath catch, a momentary connection that felt deeper than any they'd shared before. Then Jake looked away, reeling in his line and standing in one smooth motion. "Sun's getting lower," he observed. "Should head back before dark." Penelope realized he was right. The afternoon had slipped away faster than she'd noticed. She began packing up her things as Jake collected his fishing gear and catch. "I could carry one of those for you," he offered, gesturing to the fish. "Thank you," Penelope accepted, watching as he selected a plump trout and wrapped it in some leaves before handing it to her. They rowed back to Lewiston side by side, the conversation flowing more easily than Penelope had expected. Jake pointed out landmarks and shared bits of local history, revealing a depth of knowledge about the area that surprised her. As they reached the edge of town, Jake's demeanor shifted, becoming more reserved again. By the time they reached the main street, he had retreated behind his usual taciturn mask. "I appreciate the fish," Penelope said as they stopped in front of her store. "And the company." Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good evening, Miss Foster." He tipped his hat and continued down the street toward his shop, leading his horse by the reins. Penelope watched him go, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. There had been moments by the creek when she'd glimpsed a different Jake Adams, more open, almost relaxed. Why did he guard himself so carefully in town? And why did she care so much about the mystery of this man who clearly wanted to keep his distance? As autumn deepened into winter, life in Lewiston took on a different rhythm. The first snow fell in early November, transforming the town into a scene from a Christmas card. Business at the store increased as people stocked up for the colder months ahead, and Penelope found herself busier than ever. Jake was busy too, his services in high demand as ranchers prepared their equipment for winter. He had taken to stopping by the store every few days, sometimes for supplies, sometimes just for coffee and a few minutes of conversation before returning to his work. These visits became something of a bright spot in Penelope's routine, though she tried not to examine too closely why she looked forward to them. There was still a guardedness about Jake, a careful distance he maintained, but it seemed to be lessening gradually, like ice slowly thawing. One particularly cold afternoon, as Jake was warming his hands around a mug of coffee at her back table, Penelope decided to risk a more personal question. "Will you be attending the Christmas gathering at the church next week?" she asked, refilling his mug. Mrs. Thompson mentioned there would be singing and a special supper. Jake's expression closed slightly. "Not likely. Christmas isn't much of an occasion for me these days." "May I ask why?" Penelope ventured carefully. Jake was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost distant. "Last Christmas I celebrated was with my regiment in '64. We sang carols, shared what little food we had. 2 days later, half those men were dead." He stared into his coffee. Hard to feel festive after something like that. Penelope's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." Jake shook his head. "You didn't know." He took a sip of coffee, then set the mug down with deliberate care. "What about you? Big Christmas plans?" Grateful for the change of subject, Penelope told him about her plans to help with the church dinner and the small gifts she'd ordered for the children of regular customers. As she spoke, she noticed Jake watching her with an expression she couldn't quite identify, something between curiosity and admiration. "You've made a place for yourself here," he observed when she finished. "Faster than most newcomers." "I hope so," Penelope said sincerely. "I've come to care for this town and its people." Jake's gaze held hers for a long moment. "Town's better for having you in it." The compliment, simple as it was, warmed Penelope more than the coffee had. "Thank you." Jake finished his drink and stood to leave. "Storm coming tomorrow, according to my knee. Might want to stock up on lamp oil and candles, just in case." "I'll keep that in mind," Penelope said, walking him to the door. "Take care getting home if it turns bad. Always do." Jake hesitated at the threshold, looking down at her with an uncharacteristic uncertainty. If you need anything during the storm, I'll be at the shop, just so you know." Before Penelope could respond, he was gone, striding through the early twilight toward his smithy. She watched him go, a small smile playing at her lips. It wasn't much, but it felt like a door cracking open, just a little. Jake's prediction proved accurate. The storm arrived the next day with a vengeance, howling winds driving snow horizontally through the streets of Lewiston. Penelope kept the store open until mid-afternoon, when it became clear that no more customers would brave the weather. After securing the shutters and making sure the stove was well stoked, she retired to her living quarters with a book and a cup of tea. As night fell, the storm intensified. Penelope checked on Willow in her stable, making sure the mare had plenty of hay and that the small structure was secure against the wind. On her way back, she glanced across the street toward Jake's shop. Light glowed in the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting he was still at work despite the weather. Penelope was just settling back with her book when a loud crash startled her. Rushing to the window, she peered out to see that part of the roof of Jake's shop had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Without thinking, she grabbed her heaviest coat and a lantern and headed out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet as she struggled across the street. Snow swirled around her, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. By the time she reached Jake's door, her face was numb with cold. She pounded on the door, shouting to be heard above the howling wind. "Jake, are you all right?" The door swung open, revealing Jake, a look of shock on his face. "Penelope, what in God's name are you doing out in this?" It was the first time he'd used her given name, she realized distantly. "Your roof, I saw it collapse from my window. Are you hurt?" Jake pulled her inside, closing the door against the storm. "I'm fine. Part of the roof over the storage area gave way, not over the forge." He looked at her with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "You came out in a blizzard to check on me." Now that she was inside, the impulsiveness of her action struck her. "I was worried," she admitted, suddenly self-conscious. "I didn't think." Jake's expression softened. You shouldn't have risked it, but I appreciate the concern." He took her coat, hanging it near the forge where it would dry. "You're half frozen. Come closer to the fire." The heat from the forge was a welcome relief after the bitter cold outside. As Penelope held her hands out to warm them, she looked around the shop. It was surprisingly orderly. Tools hung neatly on the walls, the work area clean despite the nature of the work. Through a doorway, she could see what appeared to be living quarters similar to her own. "You live here?" she asked, rubbing her hands together. Jake nodded. "Makes sense to be close to the work." He moved to a small stove in the corner and lifted a coffee pot. "Want some? It's strong." "Please." Penelope accepted, still shivering slightly. Jake poured 2 mugs and handed her one. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Penelope felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the cold. "You shouldn't go back out in that tonight," Jake said, glancing toward the door where they could hear the wind still howling. "Storm's getting worse." Penelope's heart skipped a beat at the implication. "I don't want to impose. It's not an imposition, it's common sense." Jake's tone was matter of fact. "I can sleep in the shop, you can take the bed." "Oh, I couldn't." "You can and you will," Jake interrupted firmly. "I've slept in worse places than my own floor." Penelope recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and knew better than to argue. "Thank you, that's very kind." Jake grunted, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. Nothing kind about it, just practical. They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their coffee as the storm raged outside. Jake occasionally moved to add coal to the forge, keeping the fire hot enough to ward off the cold that seeped through the damaged roof. "I'll need to fix that tomorrow," he said, glancing up at the hole where snow was drifting in. Good thing it's over the storage area and not the living quarters. Can I help? Penelope offered. I'm not afraid of a little work. Jake looked at her appraisingly. I believe that. But roof repair in winter isn't something to undertake lightly. I'm stronger than I look, Penelope insisted. A ghost of a smile touched Jake's lips. Never doubted it. He set his empty mug aside. You should get some rest. Tomorrow's likely to be a long day with the cleanup from this storm. He led her through the doorway into his living quarters, a simple room with a bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a chest of drawers, and a bookshelf that surprised Penelope with its contents. There were volumes of poetry, history, and surprisingly, several novels. You read, she observed, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Jake followed her gaze to the books. Did you think blacksmiths are illiterate? No, of course not, Penelope hastened to clarify. You never mentioned an interest in literature. Never came up, Jake said with a shrug, though she detected a slight defensiveness in his tone. My mother was a school teacher before she married my father. She made sure I had books growing up. Penelope ran her fingers along the spines, noting several titles she recognized and a few she didn't. You have excellent taste. They pass the time on winter evenings. Jake moved to the chest of drawers and pulled out a clean shirt. You can sleep in this if you want, more comfortable than your dress. Penelope accepted the offering, a simple cotton shirt that would hang like a nightgown on her smaller frame. Thank you for everything. Jake nodded, suddenly awkward. I'll be in the shop if you need anything. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up. He turned to leave, but Penelope called after him. Jake, he paused, looking back at her. I'm glad you weren't hurt when the roof collapsed. Something flickered in his eyes, warmth perhaps, or something deeper. Get some rest, Penelope. He closed the door softly behind him. Alone in his room, Penelope changed into the borrowed shirt, inhaling the scent of soap and something uniquely Jake that clung to the fabric. She slid between the sheets of his bed, feeling both strange and oddly at home in this space that was so clearly his. As she drifted toward sleep, lulled by the sound of the storm and the distant clanging from the shop where Jake was apparently still working, she wondered at the turn her life had taken that had led her here, to this moment. Morning brought a transformed world, the storm having moved on to leave behind pristine snowdrifts and a sky so blue it hurt to look at it. Penelope woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, finding Jake already dressed and cooking at the small stove in the corner of his living quarters. Hope I didn't wake you, he said when he noticed her stirring. Thought you might want breakfast before heading back. Penelope sat up, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance and the fact that she was wearing his shirt. Good morning, and thank you, breakfast sounds wonderful. Jake nodded toward a screen in the corner. There's fresh water behind there if you want to wash up. Take your time. He stepped out to give her privacy, a consideration that touched her. Penelope quickly washed her face and hands, dressed in her clothes from the previous day, and did what she could with her hair before joining Jake in the main shop area. He had set up a small table near the forge, which radiated welcome heat in the cold morning. 2 plates of bacon and biscuits waited, along with mugs of steaming coffee. This looks delicious, Penelope said, taking a seat. I didn't know you could cook. Basic survival skill, Jake replied with a shrug. Nothing fancy. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Jake spoke again. I'll walk you back after breakfast. Need to check if there's any damage to your place from the storm. I'm sure it's fine, Penelope assured him, though she appreciated his concern. But I would welcome the company. After they finished eating, Jake insisted on clearing away the dishes himself, waving off Penelope's offers to help. When they were ready to leave, he surprised her by draping a heavy blanket around her shoulders. Snow's deep, he explained. Don't want you catching cold on the way back." The gesture was practical, but Penelope couldn't help feeling warmed by the care behind it. They stepped out into the brilliance of the snow-covered morning, Jake forging a path through the drifts that in some places reached mid-thigh. He offered his arm for balance, and Penelope took it gratefully, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at the contact. The street was eerily quiet, most residents apparently choosing to wait out the worst of the snow's aftermath before venturing out. When they reached the store, Jake insisted on checking the roof and the stable before he was satisfied that no damage had been done. "You were lucky," he said as they stood on her porch. "Roof solid, stable too." "Thanks to your construction," Penelope pointed out. "I should come help you with your repairs later." Jake shook his head. "No need. I've already got Matthews and his boy coming to lend a hand. Should have it patched by nightfall." Penelope felt a twinge of disappointment that he'd declined her offer, but nodded in understanding. "Well, if you change your mind or if there's anything else you need, you know where to find me." Jake studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I should get back. Got a lot to do before they arrive." "Of course." Penelope slipped the blanket from her shoulders and held it out to him. "Thank you for this, and for last night." Jake took the blanket, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Penelope said softly. "They wouldn't have." Something shifted in Jake's eyes, a brief vulnerability that disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. He cleared his throat. "I'll see you around, Miss Foster." With that, he turned and made his way back through the snow toward his shop, leaving Penelope to watch him go, a confusion of emotions swirling within her. The Christmas gathering at the church came and went without Jake's attendance, as he had predicted. Penelope enjoyed herself despite his absence, finding warmth in the community's celebration and the genuine friendships she was forming with several of the town's women. Still, she found her eyes straying to the door more than once, a small part of her hoping he might change his mind. The days following Christmas brought a bitter cold snap that kept most people indoors when they weren't required to be out. Penelope kept the store open, though customers were few, using the quiet time to catch up on her ledgers and correspondence. Jake came by occasionally for coffee and conversation, their friendship deepening in small, careful increments. On New Year's Eve, as Penelope was preparing to close the store early, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to find Jake standing there, a package tucked under his arm, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Mr. Adams," she greeted him with a smile. "Happy New Year's Eve." "Miss Foster," he returned with a nod. "Hope I'm not interrupting your closing." "Not at all." Penelope set aside the broom she'd been using. "Did you need something from the store?" Jake hesitated, then held out the package. "This is for you. A late Christmas gift, I suppose." Surprised and touched, Penelope accepted the package, which was wrapped in simple brown paper and twine. "You didn't have to get me anything." "Wanted to," Jake said simply. "Go ahead and open it." Penelope carefully untied the twine and unwrapped the paper to reveal a beautifully crafted iron sign. The words "Foster's General Store" were worked into the metal with an artistic flourish, small decorative elements framing the text. "Jake," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth metal. "It's beautiful. Did you make this?" He nodded, looking pleased by her reaction. "Thought your store deserved something more permanent than that old wooden sign." "I don't know what to say," Penelope admitted, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you seems inadequate." Jake shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's nothing fancy." "It's perfect," Penelope insisted. "And I have something for you too, actually. I was going to bring it over tomorrow." She moved behind the counter and produced a small package wrapped in green paper. "Merry Christmas, Jake." Now it was his turn to look surprised as he accepted her gift. With careful movements, he unwrapped it to reveal a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a simple design. "I noticed you writing sometimes," Penelope explained, suddenly nervous that she'd misread his interests. "In the evenings when you're sitting by your window. I thought perhaps you might like something nicer than those loose sheets of paper." Jake ran his fingers over the journal's cover, his expression unreadable. "No one's given me a gift like this in a long time." He looked up at her, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "Thank you, Penelope." The use of her first name sent a warm current through her. "You're welcome, Jake." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Finally, Jake cleared his throat and gestured toward the door. "I should let you finish closing up. You probably have plans for the evening." "Actually, I don't," Penelope admitted. "I was just going to have a quiet supper and perhaps read for a while." Jake hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "I was planning to ride out to Beaver Creek tonight. There's a spot there where you can see the whole valley. Good place to watch the year change." He paused. "You could come along if you'd like." Penelope's heart leapt at the invitation. "I'd love to. What time were you thinking of leaving?" "About an hour before midnight. Gives us time to get there and set up a small fire." Jake seemed almost surprised that she'd accepted. "Dress warm. It's cold out there away from town." "I will," Penelope promised. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," Jake said, moving toward the door. "I'll take care of the rest." After he left, Penelope hugged the iron sign to her chest, a smile spreading across her face. It wasn't a declaration of love or even of serious interest, but it was an invitation a step beyond the careful friendship they'd been building. True to his word, Jake arrived at her door an hour before midnight, leading 2 horses, his own sturdy gelding and Willow, already saddled and ready for the ride. He'd brought extra blankets and had packed a small bag with what looked like provisions. "Ready?" he asked as Penelope emerged, bundled in her warmest coat, hat, and gloves. "Ready," she confirmed, allowing him to help her mount Willow. They rode out of town side by side, the night air crisp and clear around them. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light on the snow-covered landscape that they had no trouble following the trail. Jake pointed out landmarks as they rode, sharing bits of local history and personal memories that gave Penelope a deeper understanding of his connection to this land. "My father brought me to Beaver Creek for the first time when I was 7, he told her as they crested a rise. "Taught me to fish and track there. Said a man needs to know the land he calls home." "It sounds like he was a good father," Penelope observed. Jake nodded. "He was, strict but fair. Never raised his hand to me or my mother, even when I probably deserved it." He fell silent for a moment. "He died while I was at war, never got to say goodbye." "I'm sorry," Penelope said softly, understanding now some of the pain he carried. Jake glanced at her. "What about your parents?" "You mentioned they died, but not how." "Influenza," Penelope replied. "They were both taken within days of each other when I was 16. My aunt took me in afterward." "That's a hard age to lose your folks," Jake said, his tone gentle. "It was," Penelope agreed. "But in some ways, I was fortunate. Many have suffered worse losses." Jake's expression suggested he understood what she wasn't saying, that she was acknowledging his own losses without prying further. They rode in companionable silence for a while longer before Jake pointed ahead. "There it is. Beaver Creek." The creek wound through a small valley, its waters mostly frozen but still visible in places where the current ran too swiftly to freeze. Jake led them to a flat area above the creek that offered a spectacular view of the valley and the mountains beyond. "This is breathtaking," Penelope said as she dismounted, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. Jake busied himself with building a small fire, using what he'd brought along in his saddlebags. Once it was crackling merrily, he spread a blanket nearby and gestured for Penelope to sit. "Should keep us warm enough," he said, joining her on the blanket and pulling another over their legs. From his bag he produced a flask and 2 small tin cups. "Whiskey, to ward off the cold." Penelope accepted the cup he offered, taking a small sip and feeling the liquor burn pleasantly down her throat. Perfect for a night like this. Jake poured himself a cup and raised it slightly. "To a better year ahead." "To a better year," Penelope echoed, touching her cup to his. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire and occasionally pointing out stars or sharing brief stories. As midnight approached, Jake checked his pocket watch. "Almost time," he said, pouring a bit more whiskey into their cups. 1 minute to go." Penelope felt a sense of anticipation that had little to do with the changing year and everything to do with the man beside her. "Jake," he turned to look at her, his face illuminated by the firelight. Thank you for bringing me here. This is special." Jake's expression softened. "Wanted to start the year right." The implication of his words that spending this moment with her was right made Penelope's heart beat faster. As his watch ticked over to midnight, their eyes met. "Happy New Year, Penelope," Jake said, his voice low. "Happy New Year, Jake," she replied softly. For a moment, Penelope thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips, and he seemed to lean slightly closer. But then he turned back toward the fire, taking a sip from his cup. "Got something else for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small object and held it out to her. In his palm lay a delicate silver pin in the shape of a willow tree, its branches fashioned from fine metal work that caught the firelight. "Made it from an old silver coin," Jake explained. "Thought it might remind you of your mare. And maybe of tonight." Penelope took the pin carefully, marveling at its craftsmanship. "Jake, it's exquisite. You made this," he nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "Smithing isn't just about horseshoes and hinges. At least it doesn't have to be." "Thank you," Penelope said sincerely, pinning it to her coat. "I'll treasure it." They stayed by the fire for another hour, talking more freely than they ever had before. Jake shared stories of his time in the cavalry during the war, not the battles, but the camaraderie, the long rides, the moments of unexpected beauty in the midst of conflict. Penelope told him about her life in St. Louis, her dreams of independence, her decision to come west. As the fire burned down to embers, Jake reluctantly suggested they head back. Cold setting in deeper now that the fire's dying. The ride back to town was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts but comfortable in the silence they shared. When they reached the store, Jake helped Penelope dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for tonight," Penelope said, looking up at him in the moonlight. "It was perfect." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "Glad you came." He hesitated, then added, "I'm riding out tomorrow with some stock for the Henderson ranch. Be gone a few days." "Oh," Penelope tried to hide her disappointment. "Safe travels, then." Jake reached out and touched the willow pin on her coat, his fingers brushing against the wool. "I'll see you when I get back." It wasn't a promise exactly, but it felt like one. Penelope nodded. "I'll be here." Jake's gaze held hers for a long moment before he stepped back. "Good night, Penelope." "Good night, Jake," she replied, watching as he mounted his horse and rode toward his shop, leading Willow behind him. As she let herself into the store, Penelope touched the silver pin at her collar, a tangible reminder of the evening and of the complicated man who had crafted it for her. The days of Jake's absence stretched longer than Penelope had anticipated. A week passed, then nearly 2, with no sign of his return. She told herself not to worry. The winter weather could have delayed him, or the job at the Henderson ranch might have been more extensive than expected. Still, She found herself watching the street from her window each evening, hoping to see his familiar figure riding into town. Mrs. Whittaker, ever observant, noticed Penelope's distraction during their weekly sewing circle. "Are you expecting someone, dear?" she asked when Penelope glanced toward the window for the third time in as many minutes. "No, not really," Penelope replied, focusing back on her needlework. "Just wondering when Mr. Adams might return from the Henderson ranch. He mentioned he'd be gone a few days, but it's been nearly 2 weeks." Mrs. Whittaker and Mrs. Thompson exchanged meaningful glances. "Jake often takes on additional work when he's out that way," Mrs. Thompson explained. "The Hendersons might have convinced him to stay on to handle some other repairs. Or he could have gone on to the Campbell place afterward," Miss Miller suggested. "I heard they were having trouble with their plow horses throwing shoes." "I'm sure that's it," Penelope said, trying to sound unconcerned. "I only mentioned it because he ordered some supplies before he left that I've been holding for him." Her explanation seemed to satisfy the others, and the conversation moved on to town gossip and plans for the upcoming Valentine's Day social. Penelope participated absently, her thoughts still straying to Jake and the night they'd spent by Beaver Creek. The next morning, as Penelope was arranging a display of new fabric that had arrived on the stagecoach, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, her heart leaping at the thought it might be Jake, only to find Sheriff Collins standing there instead. "Good morning, Sheriff," she greeted him, hiding her disappointment. "What can I do for you today?" Sheriff Collins removed his hat, his expression grave. "Miss Foster, I'm afraid I have some concerning news. There was an incident out at the Campbell Ranch yesterday. Jake Adams was injured." Penelope's heart seemed to stop. "Injured? How badly? What happened?" "Horse spooked while he was shoeing it, kicked him in the chest and knocked him against a wall. Broke a few ribs and his collarbone, from what Doc Wilson tells me. They brought him into town late last night. He's at the doctor's place now." "Is he?" Penelope couldn't bring herself to finish the question. "He's going to live," the sheriff assured her quickly. "But he's in a fair bit of pain and will be laid up for some time. Doc says he shouldn't be alone for at least a week or two, but you know Jake insists he'll be fine on his own." Relief flooded through Penelope, followed quickly by determination. "That's ridiculous. He can barely take care of himself in that condition." Sheriff Collins nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "That's what I told him. Thought you might want to know, considering." "Well, considering you two seem to have become friends. Thank you for telling me, Sheriff. I'll go see him right away." Penelope was already untying her apron and reaching for her coat. "Could you ask Mrs. Whittaker to mind the store for an hour? She knows the prices and where everything is kept." "Of course, Miss Foster." The sheriff replaced his hat. "Doc's house is the yellow one at the end of Spruce Street. I know." Penelope grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "Thank you again, Sheriff." The doctor's house was only a short walk from the store. Penelope hurried through the crisp morning air, her mind racing with concern for Jake and determination to ensure he received proper care. When she arrived, Doc Wilson's wife showed her to a small room at the back of the house where Jake was resting. He looked worse than she'd expected. His face was pale beneath his tan, with dark shadows under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept well. His left arm was immobilized in a sling, and from the careful way he was breathing, Penelope could tell his ribs were causing him significant pain. "Penelope," he said when he saw her, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "Sheriff Collins told me what happened," she explained, moving to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" Jake's expression was a mixture of discomfort and irritation. "Been better. Doc says I'll live." "Yes, and he also says you shouldn't be alone while you're healing," Penelope countered. "Which is why you're coming to stay with me until you're well enough to take care of yourself." Jake's eyebrows shot up. "I'm not staying with you. That's not proper," Penelope interrupted. "Perhaps not, but it's practical. I have the spare room behind the store that used to be my uncle's office. It has a bed and is close enough to my living quarters that I can help you if you need anything, but separate enough to maintain appearances." "Penelope, Jake," she mimicked his tone. "You can't possibly stay at your shop alone. You can't use your arm, you can barely breathe without pain, and you're too stubborn to admit when you need help. So unless you'd prefer to stay with the Thompsons or the Whitacres, who I'm sure would be happy to take you and you're coming home with me." Jake stared at her for a long moment, then let out a careful sigh that turned into a wince. "You're as stubborn as I am, aren't you?" "More so," Penelope confirmed with a small smile. "Is that a yes?" Jake closed his eyes briefly, looking resigned. "Seems I don't have much choice." "Excellent," Penelope said briskly. "I'll speak with Doc Wilson about what care you'll need, then arrange for someone to help transport you to the store." Within 2 hours, Jake was installed in the small room behind the store, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the arrangement but too worn out from the move to protest further. Penelope had enlisted the help of Mr. Matthews and his son to transport him in their wagon, padded with blankets to minimize the jolting. Doc Wilson had given Penelope detailed instructions for Jake's care: how to wrap his ribs, what signs of fever or infection to watch for, how to help him move with minimal pain. He'd also provided a bottle of laudanum for the worst of the pain, though he warned that Jake had refused to take any so far, claiming it muddled his thinking. For the first day, Jake slept most of the time, exhausted from the pain and the journey. Penelope checked on him regularly, bringing broth and water when he was awake, helping him to a more comfortable position when necessary. He accepted her help with reluctance, but growing gratitude as it became clear she wasn't going to treat him as an invalid or fuss unnecessarily. By the second evening, he was awake more consistently and clearly restless with confinement. Penelope brought him the journal she had given him for Christmas, along with a pencil. "Thought you might want something to occupy your mind," she said, setting them on the small table beside his bed. Jake looked at the journal, then at her. "Thank you. Getting tired of staring at these 4 walls. I can imagine." Penelope adjusted his pillow. "You're used to being active all day. This must be difficult for you." Jake's expression softened slightly. "You didn't have to do all this. Taking me in, tending to me." "I wanted to," Penelope said simply. "That's what friends do for each other." Jake studied her face for a long moment. "Is that what we are, friends?" There was something in his tone that made Penelope's heart beat faster. "I'd like to think so." "Unless you have another word for it." Jake's gaze held hers, intense and questioning. "Not sure there is a word for what you are to me, Penelope Foster." The admission, ambiguous as it was, sent warmth spreading through her. "Well, whatever it is, it means I care about your well-being. So you'll just have to accept my help until you're healed." A ghost of a smile touched Jake's lips. "Yes, madam." Over the next week, they settled into a routine. Penelope would tend the store during the day, closing briefly at noon to check on Jake and bring him lunch. In the evenings, after closing the store, she would sit with him while they ate supper, sharing stories about their days, hers filled with customers and new stock, his with observations from the window of his room and what he'd managed to write in his journal. Jake improved steadily, though not as quickly as he would have liked. By the end of the second week, he was able to move around with less pain, even venturing into the store for short periods to sit near the stove and observe the daily operations. Penelope found she enjoyed his company during these times. He had a sharp eye for business, and occasionally offered suggestions for rearranging displays or adding new products that might appeal to the ranchers and farmers who made up a significant portion of her customer base. One evening, after the store had closed and they were sharing a simple supper of stew and bread, Jake broached the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them. "People will be talking," he said, breaking a piece of bread, "about you taking me in like this." Penelope had been expecting this concern. "People always talk, Jake. It's the nature of small towns." "Doesn't bother you. What they might be saying, does it bother you?" she countered, watching his face carefully. Jake considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Not for my sake. But I don't want your reputation damaged because of me." "My reputation is my own concern," Penelope said firmly. "And I'd rather be known as someone who helps a friend in need than someone who turns away out of fear of gossip." Jake nodded slowly. "You're different from most women I've known." "I'll take that as a compliment," Penelope said with a smile. "It was meant as one." Jake set his spoon down, his bowl empty. "I should be able to return to my own place soon. Ribs are healing well, and I can manage most things one-handed now." Penelope felt a pang at the thought of him leaving, though she knew it was inevitable. "Doc Wilson said at least 3 weeks for the ribs and 6 for the collarbone. It's barely been 2. "I'm a fast healer," Jake insisted, "and I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "It's not an imposition," Penelope said softly. "I've enjoyed having you here." Jake's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "I've enjoyed being here too, more than I expected to." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with possibility. For a moment, Penelope thought Jake might say more, but then he looked away, breaking the connection. "Still, I should get back to my own place. Got work piling up, and I can at least supervise my apprentice on some of the simpler jobs." Penelope nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course, but not until Doc Wilson gives his approval." Jake gave her a look that suggested he might not wait for the doctor's permission, but he didn't argue the point further. The next day brought a new complication. Penelope was serving a customer when Sheriff Collins entered the store, his expression serious. "Miss Foster, is Jake here?" he asked after the customer had left. "He's resting in the back," Penelope replied, concerned by the sheriff's tone. "Is something wrong?" Sheriff Collins removed his hat. "Got a telegram from Fort Benton. There's been some trouble with a band of renegades hitting isolated farms and ranches. Army's requesting Jake's services as a scout and tracker." "But he's injured," Penelope protested. "He can barely ride." "I know that, and so do they. But Jake knows this territory better than most, and they're desperate. 3 families have been killed already." The sheriff glanced toward the back of the store. "Might be best if I speak with him directly." Before Penelope could respond, Jake's voice came from the doorway leading to the back rooms. "No need, Sheriff, I heard." He was leaning against the doorframe, his face grim. "When do they need me?" "Jake, you can't possibly," Penelope began. "As soon as possible," Sheriff Collins interrupted. "Captain Reynolds is leading the pursuit. Says they think the renegades are heading toward the Badlands." Jake nodded, his expression hardening. "I know Reynolds. Good man. Tell him I'll be ready to ride by morning." "Jake," Penelope couldn't contain her protest. "You're in no condition to ride, let alone track renegades." Jake met her gaze steadily. "People are dying, Penelope, families, women and children. If I can help stop that, a few broken bones don't matter." Penelope wanted to argue, but the determination in his eyes told her it would be futile. Instead, she turned to the sheriff. "Tell Captain Reynolds that Jake will be ready, but that he's recovering from injuries and will need consideration for that fact." Sheriff Collins looked between them, then nodded. "I'll include that in my reply. Jake, they'll meet you at the North Trail at dawn." After the sheriff left, Penelope turned to Jake, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "This is madness. You're not healed enough for this kind of exertion." "I've ridden with worse," Jake said, moving carefully to sit in the chair near the counter. "And I'm not planning to fight. Just guide them through territory I know." "And if there is fighting?" Penelope demanded. "What then?" Jake's expression softened at her obvious concern. "Then I'll stay back and let the soldiers do their job. I'm not looking to be a hero, Penelope." She wanted to believe him, but fear clutched at her heart. In the weeks since his injury, something had shifted between them. The careful distance Jake had maintained had eroded, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the reserved exterior, a man of principle and unexpected gentleness, a man whose presence in her life had become increasingly important. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake reached out with his good hand and took hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "I promise. I have something to come back for now." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Penelope's heart beat faster as Jake's thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand. "I'll need to go to my shop," he said after a moment. "Get my gear ready." "I'll help you," Penelope offered, reluctant to let him out of her sight now that she knew he would be leaving. "And then I'll make sure you have food packed for the journey." Jake nodded, seemingly grateful for her practical response rather than continued protests. "Thank you." The rest of the day passed in a flurry of preparations. Penelope closed the store early to help Jake gather what he would need. His movements were still careful and measured, his breathing sometimes catching when he turned too quickly or lifted something with his good arm. Each wince made Penelope's concern deepen, but she kept her worries to herself, focusing instead on being useful. By evening, everything was ready. Jake's saddlebags were packed with provisions and basic medical supplies, his rifle cleaned and loaded, his best tracking gear assembled. They sat together in Penelope's living quarters, sharing a final meal before what would likely be an extended absence. "How long do you think you'll be gone?" Penelope asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Jake considered the question. "Hard to say. Depends on how far the renegades have gone and how difficult they are to track. Could be a few days, could be a couple of weeks." Penelope nodded, absorbing this information. "I'll keep an eye on your shop while you're away, make sure nothing happens to it." "Appreciate that." Jake set down his fork, his plate still half full. The tension of the impending departure had clearly affected his appetite. "Penelope, about what I said earlier. That you have something to come back for." She met his gaze steadily despite the flutter in her stomach. Jake nodded, his expression serious. "I meant it, but I need you to know something about me." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "After the war, I came back different. Couldn't stand being around people much. Found it easier to work with horses than to talk to folks. Figured that's how it would stay." Penelope listened quietly, understanding how difficult this kind of personal revelation was for him. "Then you came to town," Jake continued, "and somehow things started to shift. Found myself looking forward to seeing you, to our conversations." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of discomfort she'd come to recognize. "What I'm trying to say is, I ain't got time for love. At least, I didn't think I did. Didn't want complications in my life." Penelope's heart sank at his words, but then Jake reached across the table and took her hand. "But these past weeks, being here with you, I've started to wonder if maybe I've been wrong about that." Hope blossomed in Penelope's chest. "Jake," he shook his head, cutting her off gently. "Let me finish. I'm not good at this kind of talk, and if I don't say it now, I might not find the courage again." Penelope nodded, squeezing his hand encouragingly. "I don't know what this is between us," Jake continued. "Don't have a name for it yet. But I know it's something I want to explore when I get back. If you're willing." "I am willing," Penelope said softly. "More than willing." Relief and something warmer flashed in Jake's eyes. "Good, that's good," he cleared his throat. "I should get some rest, early start tomorrow." Penelope walked him to the door of his room, reluctant for the evening to end but understanding the need for sleep before his journey. At the threshold, Jake turned to face her, his expression unexpectedly vulnerable. "Penelope," he said, his voice low, "I'm coming back. I want you to know that." Before she could respond, he leaned down and brushed his lips against hers, a gentle, fleeting touch that was over almost before it began. Then he stepped into his room and closed the door, leaving Penelope standing in the hallway, her fingers touching her lips in wonder. The morning came too soon. Penelope was up before dawn, preparing coffee and a light breakfast that Jake probably wouldn't have time to eat, but that she needed to make anyway, needing to do something useful with her hands. Jake emerged from his room fully dressed in his riding clothes, his sling replaced by a tighter bandage that would allow him some limited use of his left arm while still supporting his healing collarbone. He looked pale but determined, his jaw set in the way she'd come to recognize meant he would brook no argument. "Coffee smells good," he said, accepting the mug she offered. "There's bread and ham too if you're hungry," Penelope said, gesturing to the small meal she'd laid out. Jake shook his head. "Coffee's enough. Don't like to ride on a full stomach." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of his impending departure hanging between them. Finally, Jake set down his empty mug and stood. "Time to go," he said simply. Penelope nodded, rising to help him with his coat. As she settled it carefully over his injured shoulder, she fought back the urge to beg him to stay, to wait until he was fully healed before embarking on such a dangerous mission. Instead, she handed him his hat and said, "Be safe. Come back to me." Jake's expression softened as he looked down at her. "I will." He hesitated, then added, "Wait for me, Penelope, between this ride and whatever comes next." The echo of his earlier words that he had no time for love hung unspoken between them. Penelope's response came without hesitation. "I'll wait, however long it takes." Jake's gaze held hers for a long moment, something deep and unreadable in his eyes. Then he bent and kissed her again, more firmly this time, his good hand cupping her cheek with unexpected tenderness. When they parted, he said nothing more, simply turned and walked out the door to where his horse was waiting, saddled and ready. Penelope followed him outside, watching as he mounted with a grimace of pain that he quickly masked. With a final nod in her direction, Jake turned his horse toward the north trail and rode out of town, his figure gradually disappearing into the pre-dawn light. Penelope stood on the porch long after he was out of sight, her hand pressed to her heart, already counting the days until his return. The days following Jake's departure stretched into an anxious routine for Penelope. She kept the store running, welcomed customers, ordered supplies, and tended to Willow with careful attention. But part of her was always listening for hoofbeats, always glancing toward the door when it opened, hoping to see Jake's tall figure standing there. News came sporadically through telegrams to the sheriff. The Army patrol, with Jake's guidance, had tracked the renegades into the Badlands. There had been a skirmish, but no casualties among the soldiers. They were continuing the pursuit. No specific mention of Jake's condition, which Penelope tried to take as a good sign. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The bitter cold of deep winter gave way to slightly milder days that hinted at the eventual arrival of spring. Still no word directly from Jake, though Sheriff Collins assured Penelope that no news likely meant the mission was proceeding as planned. "Jake Adams is one of the most capable men I've ever known," the sheriff told her one afternoon when he stopped by the store. "If anyone can guide that patrol safely and come back in one piece, it's him." Penelope appreciated the reassurance, though her worry remained a constant companion. She found herself touching the silver willow pin Jake had made for her, which she wore every day now. as if it could somehow connect her to him across the miles that separated them. In the fourth week of Jake's absence, as Penelope was closing the store for the evening, a rider came thundering down the street. She looked up, heart leaping with hope, only to see it was one of the young cowboys from the Henderson ranch. "Miss Foster." He called, reining his horse to a stop in front of the store. "Sheriff sent me to fetch you. There's been word from the Army patrol." "Jake?" Penelope asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. "Is he there on their way back?" the cowboy said quickly. "Should be here by nightfall." "Sheriff thought you'd want to know." Relief washed through Penelope like a physical force. "Thank you. Thank you for bringing the news." The cowboy tipped his hat and rode off, presumably to deliver messages to others in town. Penelope closed the store with shaking hands, her mind racing. Jake was coming home tonight. She spent the next few hours in a flurry of activity cleaning his room, preparing food she knew he enjoyed, making sure everything was ready for his return. She had no idea what condition he would be in after nearly a month of hard riding with injuries that hadn't fully healed when he left, but she was determined to be prepared for any eventuality. As the sun began to set, Penelope found herself unable to stay indoors any longer. She wrapped herself in a warm shawl and went to sit on the porch, watching the northern road for any sign of riders. The first stars were appearing in the twilight sky when she finally heard the distant sound of horses approaching. Moments later, a group of riders appeared at the edge of town, moving at a steady walk. Penelope strained to make out Jake's figure among them, but the growing darkness made it difficult to distinguish one rider from another. The patrol made its way slowly down the main street, heading for the sheriff's office. As they passed the store, one rider separated from the group and turned toward her. Even in the dim light, Penelope recognized Jake's silhouette, the set of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse. He dismounted carefully in front of the store, moving with the stiffness of someone who has spent too many hours in the saddle. Penelope rushed down the steps to meet him, stopping just short of throwing her arms around him, uncertain of his condition. "Jake," she breathed, taking in his appearance. He was thinner than when he'd left, his face weathered by weeks of exposure to the elements. A new cut marked his forehead, partially healed, and his left arm was still held somewhat gingerly against his side. But his eyes, when they met hers, were clear and warm. "Penelope," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion, "you're a sight for sore eyes. Are you hurt?" she asked, scanning him for signs of new injuries. Jake shook his head. "Nothing serious, just tired and sore." He glanced back at the patrol, now dismounting in front of the sheriff's office. "Got the job done. Ran the renegades to ground before they could hit any more homesteads. And your ribs, your collarbone, healing. Army doctor looked me over a week ago, said I hadn't done any permanent damage." Jake's expression softened as he took in her worried face. "I kept my promise. I came back." "Yes, you did," Penelope agreed, fighting back tears of relief. "Are you hungry? I've made supper and your room is ready if you want to rest." Jake glanced toward his shop across the street, then back at Penelope. "If the offer still stands, I'd rather stay here tonight with you, just to sleep," he added quickly. "I'm too exhausted for anything else." "The offer stands," Penelope assured him, "for as long as you need it." Jake nodded gratefully. "Let me just see to my horse, then I'll be in." Penelope watched as he led his tired mount around to the stable behind the store. Even in his exhaustion, Jake took the time to remove the saddle, rub the horse down, and provide feed and water before seeing to his own needs. It was one of the many things she had come to admire about him, his unfailing care for the animals under his charge. When Jake finally entered the store, he looked ready to drop. Penelope led him to the table where she'd laid out a simple but hearty meal, beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie still warm from the oven. "Eat what you can," she encouraged him. "Then you should rest." Jake managed more food than she'd expected, testament to how hungry he must have been. As he ate, he shared bits and pieces of the mission, the difficult tracking through the Badlands, the eventual confrontation with the renegades, the relief when the last of them was captured or killed, knowing no more homesteads would fall victim to their raids. "Captain Reynolds is a good commander," Jake said as he finished his pie. "Listened to advice, took care of his men, made sure I didn't push myself too hard with the injuries." "I'm glad to hear it," Penelope said, clearing away the dishes. "I was worried about you every day." Jake's expression softened. "Thought about you every day, kept me going when the trail got rough." The simple admission warmed Penelope more than she could express. "You should get some sleep now. You look exhausted." Jake didn't argue, allowing her to lead him to his room. At the doorway, he paused, turning to face her. "Penelope," he began, then seemed to struggle for words. "What is it?" she asked gently. Jake took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "On the ride back, I had a lot of time to think about what I said before I left. About not having time for love." Penelope's heart quickened. "Yes, I was wrong," Jake said simply. "Maybe there was a time when that was true, when I was too broken by the war, too set in my solitary ways, but not anymore." His gaze held hers, intense despite his exhaustion. "Not since you came to Lewiston." Penelope could hardly breathe. "Jake, I love you, Penelope Foster," he said, the words rushing out as if he feared he might lose his courage. "Don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe that night at Beaver Creek. Maybe during those weeks you cared for me. Maybe even the first day I saw you, standing in front of your store looking like you could take on the world single-handed." Joy bloomed in Penelope's chest, spreading warmth through her entire being. "I love you too, Jake. I think I have for quite some time now." Relief and happiness transformed Jake's tired face. He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that started gently but quickly deepened, communicating all the longing and emotion of their weeks apart. When they finally parted, both were breathing heavily. "I should." Jake gestured toward the bed, looking regretful. "If I don't get some sleep soon, I might just collapse where I stand." Penelope nodded, understanding. "Rest now. We have time for everything else." "Tomorrow," Jake promised, his eyes already growing heavy with exhaustion. "Tomorrow, we'll talk about what comes next." Penelope pressed one more quick kiss to his lips. "Tomorrow, sleep well, Jake." She closed his door softly behind her, leaning against it for a moment as happiness threatened to overwhelm her. Jake Adams loved her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, that knowledge was enough for tonight. True to his word, Jake slept through the night and well into the next day. Penelope checked on him periodically, reassured by his deep, even breathing. When he finally emerged from his room in the late afternoon, he looked remarkably restored, though still moving with the care of someone nursing healing injuries. "How long was I out?" he asked, accepting the coffee Penelope offered him. "About 18 hours, she replied with a smile. "You clearly needed it." Jake shook his head, looking chagrined. "Can't remember the last time I slept that long. Your body is healing, it needs rest." Penelope set a plate of eggs and bacon before him, and food. As Jake ate, Penelope closed the store early, putting up a sign that indicated she would reopen the following morning. Whatever conversation lay ahead for them, she wanted the privacy and time to have it properly. When Jake had finished eating, he helped her clear the dishes despite her protests, then suggested they sit on the porch to enjoy the last of the afternoon sun. The day was unusually mild for the season, with a hint of the spring that would eventually come to the Montana territory. They settled side by side on the bench Penelope had placed there, Jake's arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. For a while, they simply sat in companionable silence, watching the comings and goings of Lewiston's Main Street. "I meant what I said last night," Jake said finally. "About loving you. Wasn't just the exhaustion talking." Penelope smiled, tilting her head to look up at him. "I hope not, because I certainly meant what I said in return." Jake's fingers traced gentle patterns on her shoulder. "Never thought I'd find this kind of feeling again, after the war. I was different, harder, couldn't seem to connect with people the way I used to." "What changed?" Penelope asked softly. Jake considered this for a moment. "You didn't push, gave me space when I needed it but didn't give up on me either. Treated me like a man worth knowing, even when I wasn't particularly friendly." "You were always worth knowing, Jake, even at your gruffest." Penelope placed her hand over his heart. "There was always something here that called to me." Jake covered her hand with his own. "Got something to ask you, Penelope, something I've been thinking about for a while now." Penelope's heart skipped a beat at his serious tone. "What is it?" Jake shifted to face her more directly. "Would you consider marrying me? Not right away if you're not ready, but someday soon." Joy bubbled up within Penelope, so intense she thought her heart might burst with it. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I would consider it. In fact, I accept." A slow smile spread across Jake's face, transforming it completely. "You're sure? I'm not an easy man, Penelope. Got my moods and my scars inside and out. And I have my stubborn streaks and my own dreams," Penelope countered. "We'll figure it out together." She paused, a thought occurring to her. "But what about your work, and mine, the store and your smithy?" Jake nodded, having clearly considered this already. "No reason we can't keep both. My shop's right across the street. We could live here above the store and I could walk to work every day." He hesitated. "Unless you'd prefer to live at my place," Penelope considered this. "The living quarters here are a bit larger, but we could always expand yours if we preferred that location. Or build something new altogether," Jake suggested. "I've got land outside of town, what's left of my family's ranch. Good spot for a house if you wanted something away from the main street." The possibilities stretched before them, full of promise. "We have time to decide," Penelope said. "For now, I'm just happy knowing we'll be together." Jake leaned down to kiss her, a lingering touch full of promise. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for that kick from that ornery horse. If I hadn't been laid up here with you looking after me, might have taken me a lot longer to admit how I felt." Penelope laughed softly. "Let's be grateful without wishing for any more injuries, shall we?" Jake chuckled, the sound warming her heart. "Deal." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, Jake and Penelope remained on the porch, planning their future together. They would marry in the spring, when the weather was fair enough for an outdoor celebration. Jake would continue his blacksmithing and horse training, Penelope would run the store, and together, they would build a life that honored both their independent spirits and their love for each other. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Lewiston. Mrs. Whittaker claimed she'd known all along that they were destined for each other, while Sheriff Collins good-naturedly demanded credit for bringing them together by informing Penelope of Jake's injury. The town's reaction was overwhelmingly positive, many expressing that the match seemed inevitable from the moment Penelope had arrived in Lewiston. The next few months passed in a blur of preparations and anticipation. Jake divided his time between his shop and helping Penelope with improvements to the store. Together, they decided to remain in the living quarters above the store for at least the first year of their marriage, giving them time to plan and build a proper home on Jake's land outside of town. As promised, they married in early May when the wildflowers were beginning to carpet the hills around Lewiston. The ceremony took place in the town square, with nearly everyone in the county in attendance. Penelope wore a simple white dress ordered from St. Louis, and Jake surprised her by appearing in a new suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Through it all, Jake remained by Penelope's side, his usual reserve softening into a quiet joy that was apparent to all who saw them. As the festivities wound down, Jake leaned close to whisper in Penelope's ear. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Adams?" Penelope smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting. "More than ready, Mr. Adams." Hand in hand, they walked back to the store that had become their home, leaving the sounds of celebration behind them. On the porch, Jake surprised her by sweeping her into his arms, mindful of her dress. "Your ribs," Penelope protested, though she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Fully healed," Jake assured her with a smile. "Besides, it's tradition." He carried her across the threshold into their home, setting her down gently in the living room that they had redecorated together over the past months. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the comfortable space. "Happy?" Jake asked, his arms still around her waist. Penelope reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "Completely." "Are you?" Jake's smile was answer enough, but he spoke the words anyway. "More than I ever thought possible." He bent to kiss her, a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership. "Turns out I had time for love after all. Just needed the right woman to wait between my rides." Penelope laughed softly, her heart overflowing with joy. "And I found exactly where I belong right here in Lewiston with you." As the night deepened around them, Jake and Penelope Adams began their life together. Two independent spirits who had found in each other the perfect complement to their strengths and the gentle healing for their wounds. The future stretched before them, bright with promise and rich with possibility, in the town that had brought them together against all odds. Epilogue: 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the newly constructed farmhouse that sat on the rolling land outside of Lewiston. It was a handsome structure, built with care by Jake's own hands with help from friends in town. Wide porches wrapped around 3 sides, offering views of the distant mountains and the small but thriving cattle operation that Jake had re-established on what remained of his family's ranch. Penelope stood on the front porch, watching as Jake guided their 3-year-old son, Samuel, on his first pony ride. Jake's hands were steady on the boy, his voice gentle as he offered encouragement. Samuel's face was a study in concentration, his features a perfect blend of his parents' Penelope's green eyes and Jake's strong jawline. From inside the house came the sounds of their daughter, 1-year-old Grace, babbling happily as Mrs. Whitaker, who had become like a grandmother to the children, entertained her. The years had brought changes to Lewiston. The town had grown, with new businesses opening along the main street and more families settling in the surrounding countryside. Penelope's store had expanded, now occupying the adjacent building as well, offering an even wider range of goods to the community. Jake's blacksmith shop had also grown, with 2 apprentices now working under his guidance, allowing him more time for the horse training he truly loved and for his family. Their marriage had deepened with each passing year, weathering the usual challenges of life together with a foundation of respect and unwavering love. Jake's nightmares from the war had gradually become less frequent, though they still occasionally troubled his sleep. On those nights, Penelope would hold him close, her presence a balm to the old wounds that might never fully heal but had ceased to define him. As Jake lifted Samuel from the pony and set him on the ground, the boy immediately began to run toward the house, eager to tell his mother about his adventure. "Mama, I rode all by myself," he called, his small legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. Penelope knelt to catch him in a hug. "I saw. You're going to be as good a horseman as your father someday." Samuel beamed with pride, then wiggled free to run inside, presumably to share his achievement with Mrs. Whittaker and his baby sister. Jake approached more slowly, leading the pony back toward the small stable. Penelope watched him, still struck sometimes by how handsome he was, especially now that happiness had softened the hard edges that grief and war had carved into him. When he returned from the stable, he came to stand beside her on the porch, his arm slipping naturally around her waist. "He did well," Jake observed, pride evident in his voice. "Not afraid at all." "Takes after his father that way," Penelope said, leaning into his embrace. "Fearless and determined," Jake chuckled, "and his mother's stubbornness. Poor child didn't stand a chance with us as parents." Penelope smiled, reaching up to touch Jake's face, now sporting a neatly trimmed beard that she had grown to love. "We've done all right, haven't we? These past 5 years." Jake's expression grew serious, his gray eyes warm as they met hers. "More than all right. You gave me a life I never thought I'd have, Penelope. A family, a purpose beyond just getting through each day." "We gave that to each other," Penelope corrected gently, "and I wouldn't change a moment of it." From inside the house came the sound of Grace's delighted laughter, followed by Samuel's excited voice regaling Mrs. Whittaker with the details of his ride. "Should we rescue Mrs. Whittaker from our children?" Jake suggested with a smile. Penelope shook her head. "She loves every minute with them. Says it keeps her young." They stood together in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Remember that day when you first arrived in Lewiston?" Jake asked suddenly. "When I was so unfriendly, telling you how to fix your door," Penelope laughed at the memory. "You were quite intimidating, Mr. Adams, all scowls and gruff advice, and you stood your ground, not intimidated in the least." Jake's arm tightened around her waist. "That's when I should have known I was in trouble." "Oh, and when did you actually know?" Penelope asked, curious about his perspective on those early days. Jake considered the question. "Probably that day by Beaver Creek when you rode out and found me fishing. You sat there so peacefully, not trying to fill the silence with chatter, just being. That's when I started to realize you were different from anyone I'd ever known. And yet you still insisted you had no time for love," Penelope teased gently. Jake turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Biggest lie I ever told myself. Thank God you were patient enough to wait me out." "I told you I would wait between your rides," Penelope reminded him. "Best decision I ever made." Jake's kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of the love that had grown stronger with each passing year. When they parted, the sound of small feet pattering across the wooden floor inside signaled their children's approach. "Ready for the evening chaos?" Jake asked with a smile. Penelope nodded, her heart full. "Always." As they turned to go inside, to the warmth and joy of the family they had created together, Penelope reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from 2 solitary souls seeking independence to partners sharing a life rich with love and purpose. They had each found what they truly needed, not in isolation, but in the bond they had forged together in a small frontier town called Lewiston.